In the ancient world, prophets were not rare. From the banks of the Euphrates to the palaces of Mesopotamian kings, voices claiming to speak for the gods echoed through the courts and temples of empires. But what if I told you that not all prophets were created equal? That while some stood in golden halls declaring victory and favor, others wandered in deserts, wept in dungeons, and were hunted by their own people, not for lies, but for speaking the truth. This is the story of two prophetic worlds, one that served kings and one that defied them, one that upheld power and one that confronted it, one forgotten in the dust of crumbling archives and one that has shaped the conscience of the world for millennia. Buried beneath the ruins of an ancient city called Mari, archaeologists unearthed tablets that shattered assumptions about prophecy. These messages, delivered in the name of gods like Ishtar and Dagon, were eerily similar in form to the words of the Hebrew prophets. But something was different, radically different. What made Israel's prophets so dangerous? Why were they rejected, imprisoned, and even killed while others were celebrated? The answer lies in what you're about to discover. The city of Mari, located on the western bank of the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria, was a thriving political and religious center during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Its rediscovery in 1933 by French archaeologist André Parrot was a watershed moment in the study of the ancient Near East. Among the most significant finds were over 20,000 cuneiform tablets from the royal archives of King Zimri Lim. These tablets included administrative records, political correspondence, and, most remarkably, texts containing prophetic oracles. These are the earliest known examples of prophetic speech recorded outside the Bible. The Mari prophets, referred to by terms like Apalu and Muhu, delivered divine messages attributed to gods such as Dagon, Adad, and Ishtar. What made these texts so revolutionary was the way they paralleled certain features of biblical prophecy. Messages delivered in first-person divine speech, moments of ecstatic utterance, and appeals to the king. However, the function of these prophets diverged sharply from the biblical tradition. Ancient prophetic traditions were widespread, but what made Israel's prophets unique was not the existence of prophecy, but the radically different theological and moral content of their messages. Prophets in Mari played a distinct and structured role within the political and religious machinery of the state. Far from being marginal figures, they were often part of the palace or temple network and functioned as spiritual advisors to the king. The primary terms used to describe these figures in the Mari texts were Apilu, which implies an intercessor or oracle giver, and Muhu, associated with ecstatic states, possibly indicating someone who trembled or convulsed when receiving divine communication. Both male and female prophets appear in the records, which is significant when considering gender roles in ancient religious life. These prophets typically delivered oracles from deities such as Dagon, Ishtar, Adad, or Shamash, most often to the king himself. The content of these messages varied, but they frequently reinforced royal decisions or offered divine assurance during times of political uncertainty, war, or ritual activity. One notable example includes a prophetess of Ishtar urging King Zimri Lim to pursue a military campaign, claiming the goddess promised victory. The prophetic process in Mari was not independent. Prophets were often connected to temple cults and operated within a tightly controlled religious political structure. Their revelations were recorded, scrutinized, and sometimes even sent to the king in sealed letters. Unlike Israelite prophets, who might walk alone into the throne room with a word of rebuke, Mari prophets were more like sanctioned spiritual functionaries, tools of affirmation rather than confrontation. This sets the stage for an important contrast. The biblical prophet as an outsider, often rejected by kings, compared to the Mari prophet who functioned within the protective embrace of royal power. One of the defining characteristics of prophecy in Mari, and indeed across much of the ancient Near East, was its integration into the machinery of the state. Prophets did not stand apart from power. They served it. In the Mari archives, oracles frequently reinforced the king's legitimacy, divine favor, and military ambitions. These prophetic voices acted as extensions of royal authority, often invoked to validate political strategies or ritual decisions. In some cases, oracles were even used to manage public morale or to manipulate rival factions within the court. Prophets in Mari often received their messages in temple precincts, particularly in association with the cults of Ishtar or Dagon. The god's messages almost always affirmed the king's actions or encouraged him toward goals he already favored. This is a critical distinction from the Hebrew Bible, where prophets frequently oppose the king's desires and policies. For example, while a Mari prophetess might tell King Zimri-Lim that Ishtar guarantees victory in battle, the prophet Micah tells King Ahab that his death is imminent, even though 400 other prophets claim divine favor. In Mari, prophetic authority was domesticated and controlled. Messages were subject to palace scrutiny. Some oracles were delivered in the presence of the king. Others were reported by trusted intermediaries like priests or military officials. Either way, the system allowed prophecy to be absorbed into bureaucratic life. This alignment of prophetic voice with political power closely resembles the modern phenomenon within charismatic and NAR movements, where prophets frequently speak blessing over political leaders or national agendas, claiming divine endorsement. The Mari model reveals what happens when prophecy is co-opted by empire. The voice of the gods becomes a mouthpiece for kings. The Bible offers a starkly different vision, one that centers not on power, but on covenantal truth and justice. Unlike their Mari counterparts who operated within royal approval, biblical prophets were often divine insurgents, outsiders who disrupted the status quo and frequently found themselves in direct conflict with kings, priests, and the majority of their society. This contrast reveals one of the most radical and countercultural aspects of the Hebrew Bible. Its prophets did not serve political power. They challenged it. Consider Elijah, who confronts King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, 1 Kings 18-21, not to bless their reign, but to expose their idolatry and injustice. He calls down drought, fire, and judgment, not rainbows of hope or military victory. Elijah is not summoned by the palace, he is hunted by it. Jeremiah, often referred to as the weeping prophet, spent his life warning Judah of coming destruction. His messages were unpopular, rejected by the people, and considered treasonous. He was thrown into a cistern, beaten, imprisoned, and branded a false prophet by the religious establishment, Jeremiah 38. Rather than receiving honor like Mari's prophets, Jeremiah declared that God's word was a burden he could not escape, Jeremiah 20 verse 9. Similarly, Amos, a shepherd from Tekoa, openly rebuked the elites of Israel for injustice, corruption, and empty worship, Amos 5:21-24. He had no royal backing, no temple endorsement, just a divine mandate. He was told to stop prophesying and go back home, Amos 7:12-13. The theological core of these prophets was covenant, not national destiny. Their authority didn't derive from court appointment or ritual status, but from a burning call to speak Yahweh's truth, often at great personal cost. This makes the biblical prophetic tradition uniquely subversive in the ancient world. Where Mari prophets served kings, Yahweh's prophets often opposed them. Where Mari prophets were safe, Israel's prophets were endangered. This divergence is not a small difference. It defines what prophecy is and exposes the dangerous alignment between modern charismatic prophets and political power, echoing Mari far more than Moses or Micah. On the surface, Mari and biblical prophets may appear quite similar. Both traditions include direct speech from deities, ecstatic experiences, dreams, visions, and messages that sometimes address kings. This formal resemblance has led some scholars to argue that Israel's prophets were simply participating in a common ancient Near Eastern religious pattern. But a closer look reveals that while the form of prophecy may overlap, the function and purpose diverge dramatically. In Mari, prophetic utterances were primarily affirmative, reinforcing the actions or aspirations of the king. The prophet might say, "The god Dagon says, I will give your enemies into your hands," or "Ishtar is walking before the army." The prophetic message served the machinery of the state. Even when these messages called for religious action, they were designed to maintain the favor of the gods, not to challenge injustice or covenantal betrayal. Biblical prophets, however, were not palace cheerleaders. Their role was corrective, not affirming. Take, for example, the scene in 1 Kings 22, where the prophet Micah is brought before King Ahab. 400 prophets have declared victory in battle, likely prophets attached to the royal court, much like Mari's. But Micah alone declares defeat and disaster, revealing a heavenly vision of deception allowed by Yahweh. He is promptly imprisoned for his unpatriotic message. Similarly, while both Mari and biblical prophets might speak in ecstatic states, the source of revelation differs theologically. In Israel, Yahweh's prophets never control the word of the Lord. They are often overwhelmed by it, compelled to speak even against their will. Even the presence of false prophets in Israel, Jeremiah 23, Ezekiel 13, mirrors the Mari model more closely. Prophets who say peace, peace when there is no peace, who follow their own spirit rather than God's. These are condemned in Israel, whereas in Mari, they'd be considered normal. The comparison is not merely literary or structural. The Bible redefines what prophecy is. It critiques not only its own false prophets, but also the entire religious political complex that turns divine speech into royal propaganda. And it still critiques such systems today. At the heart of the comparison between Mari and biblical prophets lies a fundamental conflict of worldviews. Though both claim divine communication, their understanding of the divine, humanity, and moral responsibility diverges so sharply that they are not merely variations of the same office, they are rivals in spiritual vision. In Mari and the broader ancient Near East, prophecy functioned as a tool of divine kingship and cosmic order. The gods were seen as beings whose favor could be courted, whose wills were somewhat malleable, and who existed within a divine bureaucracy that mirrored the human royal court. Prophets emerged to ensure the king was in alignment with this cosmic structure, maintaining peace, prosperity, and victory through ritual observance and political wisdom. The primary concern was order, not righteousness. In contrast, the biblical worldview is rooted in the radical claim that Yahweh is not merely the highest God in a pantheon, but the one true and holy God whose covenant demands ethical obedience, justice, and worship in spirit and truth. Biblical prophecy is not about maintaining political or cosmic equilibrium. It is about calling people back to covenant faithfulness. This involves not only loyalty to Yahweh, but care for the oppressed, purity of worship, and humility before God. This divergence is more than theological. It manifests in action. Mari's prophets speak in favor of campaigns, temples, and kings. Israel's prophets speak of widows, orphans, corruption, and idolatry. They confront systemic evil, challenge priesthoods, and rebuke nations, including their own. The prophetic war is not just over who speaks for the gods, it's over what kind of God is speaking. Is God an agent of national destiny and military success, or is he the Holy One who demands justice, even if it brings judgment on his own people? This ancient clash finds new life in the modern church. The New Apostolic Reformation, with its emphasis on dominionism, spiritual warfare, and prophetic affirmation of political leaders, far more closely resembles Mari's state-sanctioned spirituality than the confrontational legacy of Amos or Jeremiah. The biblical model is not one of cozy alliance between prophet and power, but of a faithful voice crying out in the wilderness, confronting the sins of God's people with divine fire. The sharp distinction between Mari's prophets, affirming, court-sponsored voices, and the biblical prophets, lonely, confrontational messengers, becomes a mirror through which we can assess the current prophetic movements within charismatic and New Apostolic Reformation. What emerges is a sobering realization. Much of modern prophecy, especially in popular charismatic expressions, aligns far more with Mari's model than with the biblical one. Today's so-called prophets often gather in conferences, surrounded by adoring crowds and political figures, making declarations of blessing, national destiny, financial prosperity, or vague spiritual awakenings. Like Mari's prophets, they rarely speak words of rebuke or warning unless it's aimed at outsiders, never their own leaders or followers. In many NAR circles, prophets are celebrated as visionaries for the future, often predicting victory in politics or new seasons of abundance for their audiences. Contrast this with biblical prophets who, more often than not, suffered for their words. Jeremiah was mocked and imprisoned. Amos was told to leave the sanctuary and stop prophesying. Elijah was hunted by Jezebel. Jesus himself declared, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." Luke 6:26. In other words, true prophecy is often unpopular. Moreover, modern prophetic movements often function in service to Christian nationalism, reinforcing the idea that God has chosen a specific nation or political party for special blessing. This mirrors how Mari prophets legitimated the king's reign and his military exploits in the name of gods like Ishtar or Dagon. The Bible, by contrast, consistently shows prophets confronting idolatrous alliances, political arrogance, and unjust rule, even when it meant being cast out by their own communities. What this reveals is that the crisis of modern prophecy is not stylistic, it's foundational. When prophets become celebrities, when they court kings and avoid controversy, when their messages always affirm and never confront, they abandon the biblical model and drift into the ancient heresy of divinized power. The word of the Lord becomes domesticated. In recovering the true prophetic voice, we must return to the Bible's vision, one of courage, holiness, humility, and relentless truth, even when it costs everything.